There is a moment small enough to be missed on any other day when something faint begins to register. It hasn't moved. It hasn't shifted. It hasn't grown. It has simply been there, unnoticed, sitting behind everything else you gave your attention to. And now, without forcing anything, a quiet awareness touches it. Not fully, not clearly, but with a barely perceptible contact that feels like the mind brushing against a detail it did not have space for earlier. Nothing about it announces itself. The noticing comes first, not from effort, but from the slowing that happens when everything external loses its urgency. What stands out is not the thing itself, but the change in how close your attention moves toward it. The distance between you and it was always small, yet the pace of the day kept it covered. Only when the mind loses that outward pull does it begin to sense what has been sitting just behind the usual noise. There is no shape here, no image, no memory being recalled. It's more like an internal pulse that has been running quietly without ever asking to be recognized. Now, for a brief moment, the awareness that usually spreads across too many things settles into a narrower lane, and that is enough for this faint presence to become detectable. It doesn't brighten. It doesn't sharpen. It doesn't form anything that could be interpreted. It simply becomes less lost in the blur of everything else. The shift is so small that it feels almost like an accident, the kind that happens only when the mind is not trying to find anything at all. The awareness that lands on it is gentle, neither curious nor cautious. It carries the kind of softness that appears when the internal pace dips below the threshold where distractions can hold your attention. This is not a revelation. It's a quiet collision between noticing and something that has existed all day without acknowledgement. As the mind softens into this slower rhythm, the presence becomes slightly more stable, not in form, but in the consistency of how it registers. It's similar to recognizing a faint internal signal that has been humming underneath more dominant thoughts. But unlike a signal that calls for action, this one sits in a space that doesn't require response. It asks for nothing. It doesn't even ask to be understood. Its entire function is simply to exist. And now that the conditions are right, its existence can finally be perceived. The recognition is not emotional. It doesn't create comfort or tension. It doesn't create a narrative or a question. It lives entirely outside those impulses. The mind does not try to interpret it, because interpretation would push the moment outward, turning it into something it is not. Instead, the awareness stays close to the surface, observing without gathering or connecting anything. The presence remains small, steady, and quiet, like a slight imbalance in the background that once blended into everything else, but now sits separately enough to be felt. Even with this noticing, nothing begins to unfold. No understanding forms, and no meaning is pulled from the faintness. The awareness that touches it holds a low profile, a kind of interior stillness that does not attempt to reach beyond what is immediately sensed. The mind remains in a narrow range, neither expanding nor sinking, simply staying where the noticing happened. That stability is what allows the presence to remain visible within awareness without becoming anything more than what it already is. There is something subtle about the way it sits there. Not passive, not active, just present. It feels like it has been residing in a corner of your internal world, but calling it a corner would be wrong. because corners imply space, and this is not spatial. It is simply a point of awareness that has been uninterruptedly running, only overshadowed by louder, more immediate concerns. What is different now is only that the surrounding noise has faded far enough for this quieter point to come forward. The shift doesn't feel like discovering a truth. It feels more like finally catching a tone that had been playing underneath everything else. There is no need to lean into it or pull away from it. The mind simply witnesses it in the manner one might notice an internal rhythm that was previously too subtle to register. And as soon as the noticing becomes steady, the faint presence gains a little more coherence, not in structure, but in the continuity of its feel. You sense it without completely understanding it, but that is enough for now. Time doesn't play a role in this awareness. Nothing about the noticing suggests a beginning or an end. Instead, the moment stretches slightly, giving enough room for the awareness to stay with it a little longer. The presence becomes less like a hidden detail and more like an element that had always been part of the background, simply deprived of attention. Now that the pace has slowed, the attention that used to scatter begins to settle, and the subtle element stands out just enough to remain in view. There's something grounding in the neutrality of it. Not comforting, not clarifying, just steady. The mind doesn't try to connect it to a reason or an emotion. It doesn't try to weave it into any kind of explanation. Instead, it allows the noticing to stay shallow and quiet, holding a soft contact with whatever has been sitting there throughout the day. And in this brief alignment, the presence becomes part of the moment instead of the background. Nothing more happens. It doesn't deepen. It doesn't transform. It simply stays within reach of awareness in a way it hadn't before. This is the beginning, not of insight, not of understanding, but of recognizing that something small has been here all along, waiting in a silence that was never meant to be broken, only met. There's a second moment, quieter than the first, when the awareness that brushed against that faint presence begins to recognize that it wasn't an accident. The contact wasn't a passing sensation that disappeared as soon as the mind drifted elsewhere. It lingers, not as something that grows stronger, but as something that remains available, returning to the edge of attention with a softness that doesn't pull or push. It simply stays close enough to be found again. And when awareness moves toward it a second time, the movement is even smaller than before, a subtle shift that barely feels like motion at all. This time, the noticing carries a slightly different texture. It's as if the awareness approaches with more precision, not clarity, not meaning, but a narrower quality that allows it to land more completely. You sense it not as a shape or a message, but as an internal point that has stopped blending into everything else. The moment stretches thinly, giving you enough space to register the faintest internal pulse, the kind you wouldn't have recognized during the noise of the day. Nothing inside tries to define it. The awareness isn't reaching for interpretation. Instead, it moves in a quiet, concentrated line, connecting you to that presence without turning it into something else. There's something delicate in how it holds its ground. Not firm, not fragile, but consistently steady. As awareness touches it again, the presence doesn't shift or retreat. It remains exactly where it was unchanged by the contact. This stability isn't the kind that forms an anchor or gives you direction. It's simply the kind that lets you feel the difference between noticing something once and noticing it again. The repetition gives the moment a certain weight, not heaviness, but a kind of internal relevance that gently asserts itself. The mind softens into this recognition. Even without trying, your attention narrows further, becoming more deliberate, more attuned to the subtlety of what it's sensing. The background noise that usually pulls attention outward quiets down, and this faint presence begins to stand slightly apart from the rest of your internal landscape. Not because it becomes stronger, but because the surrounding distractions lose their hold. The awareness isn't looking for a pattern. It isn't comparing or judging. It simply stays close to the presence that has revealed itself twice now. What emerges is a sense of proximity, an internal closeness that doesn't rely on metaphor or imagery. It feels like an element sitting within the narrowest band of perception, the part that only becomes active during low internal movement. As soon as you slow enough to notice it again, you realize that it had probably been trying to surface in small ways throughout the day, not intentionally, but simply because it existed. You just weren't aligned with it before. Now the quiet allows the alignment to occur repeatedly, each time with the same muted consistency. The awareness shifts again, as lightly as a breath you weren't paying attention to. This shift doesn't push deeper or rise higher. It moves laterally within the same internal range, adjusting itself enough to recognize a slight difference in how the presence feels now compared to the first moment. It hasn't changed. What has shifted is the quality of your attention. The mind no longer brushes past it. Instead, it hovers steadying itself in a way that allows the presence to remain within reach without effort. The presence itself begins to feel more coherent, not more complex, not more detailed, but more singular. What was once indistinct now feels like a single point of awareness with its own quiet tone. It doesn't communicate anything. It doesn't indicate any direction. It simply sits with a kind of neutral consistency that the mind can finally register at a stable pace. This stability doesn't invite reflection. It doesn't create emotional resonance. It exists outside those impulses. It is simply something that has been ignored until now. As awareness continues to hover near it, a small internal shift occurs not forward or backward, but inward. The shift feels like the mind turning slightly toward its own center, the place where subtle signals are easier to detect. In this space, the presence becomes more accessible, not because it grows louder, but because your attention is no longer scattered. It becomes easier to sense the faint pulse that sits at the core of this presence, a pulse that has been running quietly all day unnoticed. Even now, the mind doesn't try to grasp it. It doesn't attempt to form an understanding or extract meaning. Those impulses would distort the quietness of the moment. Instead, you allow the awareness to remain unstructured, free from interpretation, anchored only to the feeling of the presence being there. This is not a revelation, nor is it the beginning of clarity. It is simply the second step in a process that has no direction and no goal, only a gradual recognition of something that has been waiting in silence. There is a particular softness in how the presence returns. Not gentleness in the comforting sense, but gentleness as an absence of force. It doesn't demand you pay attention yet. When your attention drifts slightly toward it, it meets you with the same subtle consistency as before. The repetition confirms that this presence isn't transient. It is steady, persistent in a quiet way, and it anchors itself within the narrow band of awareness that has opened up. The internal environment adjusts again, but the adjustment is so faint that it barely qualifies as a shift. It's more like the mind settling into a slightly lower frequency, where subtle signals become recognizably separate from the rest. The present sits within this frequency, unchanging, unembellished, a simple point of internal reality that existed long before you slowed enough to notice it. What becomes clear, not in meaning, but in sensation, is that this presence has been part of you all day, not shaping anything, not influencing anything, but simply existing. Now that you've noticed it twice, you begin to recognize the internal motion of your awareness as it circles closer each time without disturbing the stillness that surrounds it. The mind remains quiet low in activity, giving room for the presence to remain in focus without expanding into anything it shouldn't. And as the moment stretches, the presence becomes less like background and more like a steady internal note that has finally surfaced into your awareness. It doesn't speak, doesn't signal, doesn't guide. It just exists. And for now, that existence is enough. There comes a point where the awareness that is brushed twice against that faint presence begins to move with a rhythm that is barely perceptible. It isn't a pronounced motion, nothing resembling a path or direction. It's more like a slow, internal shift that happens when the mind stops spreading outward and begins to move within a much narrower range. This movement isn't forward, nor is it a return. It feels like something inside has eased just enough to let another small layer of noticing settle into place. The shift is so delicate, it could happen without being felt at all, yet it creates a subtle difference in how that background presence is approached. The presence itself remains steady, unchanged, neither brightening nor receding. It simply continues to rest where it has been holding its quiet neutrality. What has changed is the quality of the mind's movement around it, no longer brushing past it or stumbling into it, but beginning to navigate toward it with a gentle, low-flow motion. This is not curiosity. This is not seeking. It is the natural way the mind behaves when it slows enough to sense its own internal texture. The presence sits where it sits, and the awareness begins to move lightly within its own space, drifting closer without intention. This movement does not create clarity. It does not form meaning. It does not open anything. Instead, it lets the presence feel more reachable. The small shift in awareness allows a kind of continued contact, a gentle approach without pressure. The moment feels suspended, held in a balance where nothing is being asked of the mind. The slight internal motion continues to unfold like a mild current shifting beneath the surface of thought, too gentle to be called change, too steady to be called stillness. You notice the presence again, not because it becomes stronger, but because the quietness of the mind smooths out the distractions that once masked it. This is what low-flow movement feels like, not a surge, not a pause, but something between the two. A slow, internal transition that allows certain things to be sensed without urgency. The mind moves in a soft, muted line, contacting the presence without disrupting it. And every time it moves in this direction, The presence holds its position with the same quiet stability. There's something subtle in the way the mind glides across its own internal surface here. The movement isn't a search. It isn't an exploration. It feels more like an unconscious resetting of the internal arrangement one that leaves room for the presence to be perceived with slightly more consistency each time. There's no shaping, no structuring, only a gentle shift that creates a faint distinction between what is background and what is now being quietly observed. You sense a calm in the movement, though not the comforting kind. It's more like the absence of resistance, the way awareness behaves when it no longer has anything to brace against. The internal motion continues slowly carrying the mind toward that presence in unforced increments. With each micro shift, the presence takes on a more identifiable tone. Not a shape, not a message, not a memory, just a tone, a kind of internal hum that you can now feel with more steadiness. This tone doesn't resonate. It doesn't echo. It simply exists with a muted consistency. The awareness tracks it with a softness that feels almost fragile, as if pressing too firmly would cause the moment to fall apart. Yet nothing about it is unstable. The movement that leads to it is so light it never threatens to overwhelm anything. It's the kind of motion that emerges naturally from being unoccupied movement that rises when the mind no longer runs to meet something else. As the awareness moves in this way, a small continuity forms. It's not a pattern, and it's not a rhythm. It's more like the sense that the mind is beginning to understand where this presence sits, even if it cannot describe it. The low-flow motion feels internal, narrow, and precise, far from the wide spreading that characterized earlier parts of the day. With each shift, the presence becomes more familiar, not in meaning, but in feel. There is a faint steadiness now, as though the awareness has learned to hover near the presence without disrupting it. The movement that once caused the noticing to feel accidental now feels slightly more deliberate, though not from effort. It's simply that the mind has become accustomed to the faint internal path that leads back to it. This path isn't tangible. It's the repeated micro-movement that happens when the mind is no longer pulled by anything louder. The presence unchanged offers no story. It offers no interpretation. It offers no emotional signal. Its entire quality rests in being quietly there. And as the awareness moves in this narrow, gentle flow, it begins to recognize that the presence has a subtle constancy. This constancy isn't grounding in the traditional sense. It doesn't make you feel centered or balanced. Instead, it gives you something faint and uninterrupted to track within yourself, a point that stays intact even as your internal movement remains slow and muted. Each movement toward it becomes easier. The mind doesn't push. It doesn't reach. It simply follows the same low internal motion that has begun to form on its own. And within that motion, the presence gains a small familiarity, the kind that doesn't require understanding to feel real. When awareness touches it again, the contact feels smoother, less abrupt. The moment stretches slightly long enough for the presence to become unmistakable as part of your internal environment. You remain here in this low-flow state, letting awareness move quietly without aim. Nothing expands. Nothing sharpens. Nothing settles. Instead, the mind continues its soft internal pacing, and the presence continues to receive it with the same muted steadiness as before. It is a simple exchange movement, and noticing, and movement without any need for interpretation. And in this quiet repetition, the presence becomes something the mind can return to without searching. It becomes a subtle point of recognition that no longer fades when the world grows dimmer. It simply exists, waiting for the next moment when awareness moves lightly enough to reach it again. There is a shift so slight it almost escapes notice, yet it marks the moment when that quiet presence in the background begins to feel more continuously near. It doesn't come forward, it doesn't rise, it doesn't gather itself. Instead, the awareness that has touched it several times now begins to settle around it with a softer consistency, as if the mind has grown familiar with the internal motion required to reach it. The presence hasn't changed in strength or tone. What deepens is the way your attention lingers, returning without hesitation, staying close for longer stretches of time. The internal motion that leads you toward it becomes smoother, not stronger, not more defined, just smoother, like a movement that no longer conflicts with anything else inside. There's no expansion in this motion. It does not open out. It does not travel outward. It does not widen into any internal dimension. Instead, it folds inward, remaining narrow and quiet, guiding you toward the same small point you've been sensing. This inward quality gives the moment a subtle focus, though not the kind that sharpens anything. It's focus in the sense of attention holding a stable position for a little longer than before. The present sits exactly where it has been all along, but it feels slightly more integral now, not in the sense of importance, but in the sense that it no longer vanishes when attention relaxes. Its consistency is what becomes noticeable. It does not intensify. It does not soften. It does not fluctuate. It simply persists steady in its neutrality, waiting in the same quiet posture, regardless of whether you reach it or drift away. And now, as awareness circles back once more, the presence feels less like an isolated point and more like a constant tone that has been unnoticed beneath louder currents. You sense this constancy not because anything is clarified, but because the internal atmosphere has lost the urgency that once kept it hidden. Even without intending to, the mind begins approaching it with a kind of natural alignment. That alignment is gentle interior, almost passive, like the awareness leaning into a faint internal pull without being directed by it. The approach is quiet, soft, and almost weightless. The presence doesn't move. The awareness simply learns how to reach it with less friction. As this contact deepens, it feels as though the presence begins occupying slightly more of your inner attention, not by expanding, but by becoming more familiar. This familiarity does not turn it into anything. It stays undefined, soft-edged in a way that avoids all imagery. It resists becoming a feeling, a thought, or an interpretation. Its entire quality lies in existing without forming something identifiable. The mind grows accustomed to its neutrality, to its quiet tone, and to the softly persistent sense of here, but not demanding that comes with it. There's a slight elongation in the moment now, a stretching of the internal pause that keeps your awareness in place long enough to sense the presence without interruption. This elongation doesn't feel deliberate. It arises naturally from the low movement of thought, the way ideas slow into a pace where smaller things can be perceived. The presence benefits from that slowness, receiving your awareness with a steadiness that feels deeper than before, though nothing inside actually descends. It is depth only in the sense that you remain with it longer, not because the presence has gained substance. The mind traces the same narrow motion, again returning to the presence as if the internal path that leads to it has become more defined. This path has no direction, no structure. It's simply the repeated movement of awareness into the same quiet place. And each time, the presence responds the same way, neither shifting nor stabilizing, simply resting with the unchanged quality it has carried all day. The deepening that occurs is not within the presence itself, it's within the awareness that hovers near it, learning to remain without needing to explore. You feel this repeated nearness as a kind of internal warmth, not emotional warmth, but the warmth of familiarity, the way something becomes easier to hold in attention once you've touched it enough times. This warmth doesn't provide comfort, it provides connection. The connection is subtle, minimal, built from repeated moments of noticing. The presence feels anchored not because it anchors you, but because your awareness has found the internal rhythm that brings it back consistently. There is a point where the awareness no longer approaches cautiously. It knows where the presence rests, even if it cannot describe it. This knowing is not intellectual. It's the kind that comes from repeated contact with something that has stayed exactly the same every time you encountered it. The presence hasn't deepened or changed, but your familiarity with its steadiness has. And that familiarity allows the moment to feel more settled, more continuous, without tipping into stillness or resolution. In this deeper contact, there is no revelation. There is only the ongoing sense that the presence is undeniably part of your internal space. This realization doesn't produce clarity. If anything, it preserves the absence of clarity, inviting the awareness to remain soft, low, and undemanding. The presence becomes a quiet axis, not a center, not a guide, just a point you can return to without needing to navigate. You notice that the internal motion, which brings you here, has become more circular, though not in any spatial sense. Circular only in the sense that it repeats without needing direction, moving through a sequence of subtle shifts that carry you back to the same recognition. This presence has been here, unchanged for longer than you realized. It doesn't become clearer, it merely becomes more certain, and that certainty comes without any mental movement toward meaning. As your awareness rests near it again, the moment deepens, not downward, not inward, but in duration. The presence remains the same, but your ability to stay with it grows as if the quiet has become broad enough to hold a single faint point without distraction. This deepening is gentle, unforced, free of expectation. You remain close, sensing the same internal pulse that has been running beneath the day's noise, finally meeting it with the steadiness it always held. It is still the same presence, unshaped, faint, consistent, and yet the moment feels fuller now because you are finally able to stay with it long enough to sense its quiet endurance. There is a soft shift in how the background presence feels, not in strength, but in texture. The awareness that has been returning to it begins to notice tiny variations, faint differences in how it sits within your attention, as though it carries more than one tone within its quietness. These variations are not layers, not structures, not anything that stacks or builds. They're simply gentle differences that emerge when the mind slows enough to sense something more subtle than before. The presence itself remains unchanged. What shifts is the quality of contact between awareness and the faint point that has been waiting all day. This contact takes on a kind of internal gradient, not a visual one, not a metaphor for depth, just a gradual shift in how the presence registers. In one moment, it feels muted, and in the next, it feels slightly firmer, then softer again, as though its internal texture drifts between a few quiet states. None of these states are strong enough to define. None of them settle into clarity. They simply move along a spectrum so gentle that it can only be felt when the mind is stripped of everything fast or loud. The gradient is subtle enough that if attention brightened even slightly, it might disappear. It thrives in the dimmer, quieter rhythm you are in now. Only here can you sense the way the present seems to breathe, without actually expanding or contracting, just shifting in tone, as if the awareness itself is passing through faint internal currents. These currents aren't directional. They do not carry you anywhere. They glide across the presence the way one might touch something with different parts of the same hand, noticing slight changes without meaning to. The presence doesn't respond to this noticing. It remains indifferent, steady, unaffected by the awareness that moves across it. It is this indifference that gives the gradient its softness. Nothing inside the presence calls for attention. The variation arises purely from the quiet responsiveness of your awareness. As you linger near it, the mind becomes sensitive to the faintest shifts, those that would have been lost under the weight of the day's motion. You begin to sense that the presence has an internal quality that isn't singular. It isn't one tone, one pulse, one feeling. It seems to hold several faint notes that blend into each other without forming a pattern. These notes aren't emotional. They don't lean toward calm or heaviness. They hover in a space between definitions, allowing you to feel them only as traces. Each trace comes forward briefly, then recedes without disappearing, replaced by another tone with nearly the same softness. None of these tones move you. They don't stir anything, don't evoke anything. They simply exist within the presence, revealing themselves one at a time as your awareness brushes across them. It's like finding different textures within something that had once felt uniform, realizing that the uniformity was only a result of distraction. With enough quiet, faint distinctions, emerged not separate enough to isolate, not strong enough to identify, but present enough to change the feel of the moment. The gradient becomes a kind of internal landscape, but not in the spatial sense. There are no distances, no directions, no surfaces. It is landscape only, in the way that multiple faint qualities can exist within the same internal point. You sense them shifting, but not unfolding. They remain in place, yet they change. They exist as potential, not progress. And the mind follows these shifts with careful attention, noticing each one without trying to understand what it means. In the softness of this moment, you can feel how the presence is neither static nor active. It sits somewhere between those states, steady but alive, quiet but textured. Staying with it becomes easier because the awareness now has something to touch, even if that something cannot be named. The gradient gives the presence a kind of internal life, one that does not depend on emotion or thought. It exists purely as the sensation of something faint, shifting in tone as your attention moves across it. The awareness continues to pass over the presence each time detecting a slightly different quality. Sometimes it feels more muted, like a dim point softened by distance. Sometimes it feels more defined, like a tone that suddenly stands out without becoming clear. Sometimes it carries a faint warmth, not emotional warmth, but something like a subtle internal friction that is neither heavy nor light. These changes don't create movement, they create texture. Every shift inside the gradient feels quiet, almost hesitant, as though the presence is revealing itself gently enough to avoid overwhelming your attention. The mind adapts to this softness, learning to stay steady without reaching. The presence becomes a kind of internal canvas, not for imagery, but for the sensation of variation itself. It's a place where different tones can be felt without the need for narrative conclusion or clarity. There is a moment where the awareness lingers and the gradient becomes more pronounced, not stronger, but more distinct. The texture shifts are easier to sense. The presence feels both familiar and newly complex, though not complex in any structured way. It is complexity in the sense that multiple faint impressions can exist within the same quiet point. None of these impressions contradict each other. They coexist in a way that matches the softness of the moment. You remain here, sensing the gradient as it moves subtly within the presence. No part of it grows dominant. No part fades enough to disappear. The awareness moves slowly, adjusting to each shift, allowing every faint tone to show itself before receding into the background. The entire moment feels suspended, held not by stillness, but by the gentle continuity of these subtle variations. The presence remains unspoken, undefined. It reveals nothing except the way it feels in the dim interior of your awareness. The gradient becomes the only signal you need, a quiet proof that the presence has more than one internal note, even if none of them can be understood. And as the mind stays with these shifts, the moment deepens without darkening, expands without widening, and continues without becoming anything other than the soft internal texture it has always held. There is a point where the quiet presence you've been returning to begins to show something even smaller inside it, something so faint it almost slips past awareness the moment it appears. It isn't a second version of the presence, not an inner core, not a shape within a shape. It is more like a subtle interruption, a soft tremble of sensation that briefly shifts the feeling of the presence without altering it entirely. You sense it the way one might sense a tiny fluctuation in temperature, not enough to call change, but enough to know something just moved. This movement is delicate. It arrives without rhythm, without pattern, without repetition. It surfaces in an instant, leaves just as quickly, and then lingers only as an after effect, a suggestion that something inside the presence holds additional texture. Nothing here grows more complex. Nothing multiplies. Nothing opens. The present stays quiet and steady. What becomes more intricate is your ability to perceive the smallest motions within it. The awareness hovers near the presence, and in this closeness, it becomes capable of detecting hints of something thin and nearly imperceptible. It isn't a layer, not a veil, not anything that can be peeled back or examined. It is simply a small interior variation, a tiny shift of tone that changes the way the presence presses against your attention. In one moment, it feels softer. In another, it feels slightly more concentrated. Neither state lasts long enough to become familiar. Both fade the instant you try to focus on them. You begin to sense that these micro movements are not emerging from the presence as much as they are emerging from your awareness of it. It's as though your attention is learning to touch the presence with greater precision, registering subtleties that were previously too quiet to recognize. This precision does not sharpen anything. It refines nothing. It simply reveals that a single internal point can contain more than one sensation without becoming anything defined. The moment stretches in a way that allows the micro shift to appear again. This time, it feels like a slight tightening, not physical, but perceptual, a moment where the presence becomes momentarily more compact, as if your awareness has brushed against a firmer part of it. Then almost immediately, the sensation thins, softens, and returns to its usual muted tone. The fluctuation is so brief that it barely registers, yet it changes the quality of your connection to the presence. The mind remains still enough to catch these changes. It is a kind of stillness that comes not from trying to be calm, but from the absence of anything pulling your attention outward. The internal environment becomes sensitive alert in a quiet, low arousal way. This sensitivity allows you to feel the micro layer more clearly, not as something rising to be understood, but as a subtle internal tremor that gives the presence a new kind of dimension. This dimension is not spatial. It is not structural. It is not something that spreads. It is simply the awareness that the presence is not a single uniform tone. It contains slight irregularities, gentle ripples in how it feels that appear only when awareness touches it softly enough. These ripples are not messages or signals. They are not expressions of emotion or meaning. They exist without purpose, the way faint sounds can exist inside a quiet room, without drawing attention until everything else becomes silent. When the awareness settles again, the micro detail surfaces once more. This time, it feels like a muted vibration, a sense that the presence is briefly more active. But active is too strong a word. It's more accurate to say that the presence becomes momentarily textured, as if a small internal pulse has found its way into your perception. The pulse does not repeat. It does not strengthen. It fades the moment you acknowledge it, slipping back into the larger softness of the presence. You stay close, sensing the faint distinctions when they appear. None of them form patterns. None of them accumulate. They exist as isolated moments, tiny flickers that add richness to the presence without changing its overall neutrality. What feels significant is not the flicker itself, but the fact that you are now quiet enough to detect it. Awareness begins to adjust to this level of sensitivity. Each time the micro layer reveals itself, the mind becomes more capable of recognizing how small the shift truly is. And yet the shift feels meaningful, not because it carries meaning, but because it confirms that the presence has more subtlety than you initially realized. The presence is not a flat sensation. It is not static. It is not empty. It contains small internal motions that happen independently of your interpretation. There is a faint intimacy in these micro reveals, the intimacy of noticing something that exists only in the quietest angle of your perception. You cannot force it to appear. You cannot hold on to it when it comes. It exists on its own terms, surfacing only when your awareness reaches a particular kind of softness. The softness is not emotional. It is perceptual, a low-pressure state where nothing tries to influence anything else. The micro layer does not build toward anything. It does not accumulate into a larger insight. It does not gather into clarity. Each small appearance is independent, almost self-contained. This gives the presence a quality that feels quietly alive, though not animated. It feels like something that breathes without movement, speaks without sound, exists without wanting anything from you. As the moment deepens, the micro layer becomes easier to anticipate, not in the sense of expectation, but in the sense of readiness. Your awareness becomes attuned to the faint shifts, prepared for them to appear without needing them to. This attunement is subtle, a form of quiet cooperation between your awareness and the presence. You remain open to whatever small pulses emerge, sensing each one with the same neutrality that has defined this moment from the start. Eventually, the presence feels fuller, not because it contains more, but because you are finally able to feel what it already held. This fullness is gentle, unspoken, composed entirely of micro movements that exist without explanation. And in this quiet sensitivity, the awareness begins to understand that even something faint, when noticed closely enough, can reveal an entire world of subtle shifts that ask for nothing but the simple act of being noticed. There is a point where the internal rhythm begins to drop into a quieter register, not by falling or descending, but by loosening the small tensions that once kept certain thoughts moving faster than they needed to. The shift is gentle enough that you almost miss it. It feels less like a change and more like a release, something inside no longer holding the same firmness it held earlier. The presence you've been returning to remains exactly where it was, but your approach toward it now carries a slower pace, as if the awareness itself has thinned into something softer and more patient. This lowering isn't an action. It isn't a decision. It simply happens as the mind reduces the unnecessary movements it had been carrying. You can feel the way attention becomes less inclined to wander, less reactive, less eager to chase the next internal fluctuation. The awareness becomes steadier, though not in a stabilizing sense. It becomes steady in the sense that it no longer tries to rise toward anything. It stays low, close to where it is, allowing the presence to sit within reach without forcing itself forward. As the pace drops, the background presence seems more fitting to the moment. Not louder, not stronger, just more compatible with the internal quiet that is forming. You sense that the presence has been waiting for this particular pace, the pace where the mind is slow enough to match its muted tone. It is not a meeting. It is not an alignment. It is simply two internal rhythms becoming similar enough that they no longer interrupt each other. The present stays quiet, and your awareness steps into its quiet without effort. You begin to notice how the lowering pace changes the quality of your attention. It feels less like reaching and more like resting, not resting as in relaxing, but resting as in no longer lifting itself into higher levels of activity. The awareness remains upright, but quiet, dim, but aware, present, but not searching. This soft lowering allows you to feel the presence without the noise that usually surrounds internal noticing. In this lowered rhythm, the presence becomes clearer, not in definition, but in presence. It feels less obscured. It feels more available. The micro movements you sensed earlier are still there, but now they appear as natural parts of the presence rather than separate fluctuations. The awareness doesn't fragment the moment into parts. It simply receives the presence as a whole, even though that whole remains undefined and unambitious. There is a slight heaviness to the pace, not heavy in weight, but heavy in slowness. The awareness moves as though each motion requires more time, more quiet, more patience. But the heaviness doesn't dull anything. It brings a deeper quality to the moment, a feeling that the internal noise has finally dropped below the threshold where the presence can exist without being overshadowed. You sense the presence in a new way now. It feels closer, though it has not moved. Your awareness has moved downward in intensity, not downward in space, so the presence feels like it occupies a region of mind that was too subtle to touch when your thoughts were more active. This closeness doesn't create intimacy. It creates a quiet familiarity that continues to grow with every small return. The lowering pace brings with it a soft persistence. The awareness holds its position longer, not because it is anchored, but because there's nothing pulling it upward. The internal world becomes muted, and in that muting, the presence gains more room. You feel the nearness as something simple, an internal point that doesn't need to reveal anything. It is content to exist in silence, and you are finally slow enough to sit with it. There is an absence of expectation now. The awareness no longer wonders if the presence will shift or reveal something new. It stays with what is here, sensing the faint textures that form and fade without pattern. This acceptance is not emotional. It is perceptual. The mind accepts the moment as it is because it no longer has the energy to chase anything louder. The lowering has removed the impulse to interpret. In this pace, the presence begins to show small fluctuations again, but they appear differently than before. Instead of surfacing as isolated pulses, they now feel woven into the single tone of the presence. A faint tightening, a small release, a shift in temperature-like sensation, each one arrives without disturbing anything else. You sense them as part of the general experience rather than as separate phenomena. This blending feels natural in the lowered rhythm. As awareness continues to stay near the presence, begins to feel more grounded, not grounded in the sense of being rooted, but grounded in the sense that it feels steady within the lowered internal pace. You can sense the difference in how your mind holds it now. It no longer flits away or jumps outward. It stays calm, stays close, stays low. The lowering isn't pulling you into anything. It's simply making everything around you quieter, so the presence can be felt without interruption. You realize that the presence never needed clarity. It never needed interpretation. It needed only this lower rhythm, the one where attention stops running ahead of itself. In this rhythm, the presence feels almost natural, as though it belongs to this quiet space more than it ever belonged to the day's noise. It doesn't try to be understood. It just exists, faint but steady. The awareness holds the moment in a way that doesn't strain. It sits quietly, letting the presence be part of the internal environment without dominating anything. The moment feels balanced, not symmetrical, not structured, just balanced in the sense that nothing is being demanded, nothing is being avoided. You remain with the presence because the lowered internal rhythm makes it easy to. And in this subtle ease, the presence begins to feel entirely undisturbed. It remains what it has always been, small, muted, steady. And now your awareness has matched it, lowered itself enough to finally coexist with it in a quiet that feels natural, unforced, and dimly complete. There is a moment when the lowering from before transitions into something even quieter, a kind of internal slowdown that doesn't feel like a deliberate action, but like an unavoidable shift in the entire rhythm of your awareness. It's not a descent, not a release, not a fade. It's simply the mind choosing a different speed without announcing the change. Everything inside begins to move with a more deliberate softness, as if each internal motion has been asked to take its time not by force, but by the natural pull of the moment. The presence you've been sensing still rests where it has always been, but now the way you approach it changes again. Instead of arriving in soft pulses or lowered movements, your awareness drifts toward it through a slower internal pacing one that unfolds without urgency. The presence doesn't brighten. It doesn't intensify. It doesn't express anything new. What changes is the length of time your attention can stay with it before slipping away. The slowdown extends this time, allowing the presence to linger in your awareness without needing to assert itself. The mind no longer leaps between ideas. It doesn't reach for interpretations. It holds a kind of gentle suspension where thought doesn't stop, but moves with such minimal velocity that each shift becomes barely noticeable. This is the kind of rhythm where small internal movements stretch out, where faint sensations take longer to form and longer to fade. The presence fits this rhythm easily. It seems designed for it, even though it hasn't changed at all. You begin to feel how the slowdown affects your perception. Awareness becomes broader, not in space, but in duration. It has more patience, more quiet, more willingness to remain where it is. Your connection to the presence becomes more stable, not in structure, but in continuity. The awareness doesn't rush past it or skim over it. It settles into a long, slow gaze that has no intention behind it. The slowness removes the pressure to understand, leaving only the experience of noticing. This slowdown also reveals subtleties that were invisible earlier. Not new details, not hidden elements, just small tonal differences that take time to emerge. The presence feels more, even more consistent, yet with faint variations depending on how slowly the awareness moves around it. When your attention shifts slightly, the presence takes on a muted firmness. When the attention softens, the presence becomes lighter. These differences are smooth, almost fluid, but they never become definition. They remain sensations changing only because time has slowed enough to make them perceptible. The awareness adapts to this new pacing. Thoughts that once interrupted your focus now pass quietly, as though they no longer have the energy to pull you away. The internal world becomes a low-frequency space where everything seems to move at a slower rate, and within that rate, the presence feels perfectly placed. It doesn't compete. It doesn't retreat. It simply aligns with the slow rhythm and becomes easier to stay with. As the slowdown deepens, the mind slips into a state where effort feels unnecessary. You're not holding the presence. You're not tracking it. You're not examining it. The slow rhythm allows it to remain within the center of your attention without needing to be maintained. It's similar to the way a thought can stay present without being actively held, not because it's strong, but because the mind isn't moving fast enough to lose it. You begin to sense that the presence has a quiet endurance. Not strength, not resilience, just the ability to remain. In the faster rhythms of the day, it was too faint to survive the noise. In the lowered pace, it was detectable, but delicate. In this slow rhythm, it becomes consistent. Its consistency doesn't express importance. It expresses compatibility with the quiet you're in now. It is the kind of presence that only exists fully when everything else is slow enough to let it remain. The moment stretches, but not in a way that feels elongated. The stretching is soft, barely noticeable. Time inside the mind feels different, not longer or shorter, but smoother. Internal transitions take place without urgency, and each one moves you gently back toward the presence without intentionality. You feel the presence again, not differently, but more continuously. The slowdown lets you stay with it long enough to sense how naturally it fits into your internal rhythm. The presence doesn't feel like something discovered. It feels like something that was always meant to be noticed at this particular speed. The speed reveals nothing new. It simply removes distractions that once masked the faintness of it. There is a softness to the slowdown, a kind of muted quality that coats the internal environment. Nothing sharp forms here, nothing pressing, nothing insistent. The presence fits this softness so well that you begin to realize the slow rhythm might be closer to its natural state. Perhaps this presence has always existed in a cadence similar to this one, and only now are you slow enough to meet it properly. As the moment deepens, awareness moves even more slowly. Each thought passes with a long interval between its beginning and its disappearance. The present sits within these intervals, filling the spaces that used to be too brief for anything subtle to remain. You feel its persistence, not as pressure, but as quiet endurance. It remains available, unchanging, steady. Eventually, the slowdown becomes the primary quality of the moment. You are not slowing down toward the presence. You are slowing down with it. The two rhythms are no longer separate. Your awareness and the presence move together softly, slowly, without any desire to accelerate or clarify. The moment becomes a long, gentle breath, not literally, but in the sense that everything stretches and contracts with an unhurried regularity. Nothing pushes forward. Nothing pulls back. The present stays exactly as it is, and your awareness stays slow enough to remain beside it. There is a quiet completeness in this, not completion, not understanding, just the simple fact that nothing here needs to change to feel whole. There is a particular kind of internal motion that appears only after the slowdown has taken full shape. It is not a turn, not a shift in direction, not a movement through any kind of internal space. It is subtler than that, more like a gentle rearranging of attention within the same narrow area you've been inhabiting. You don't feel yourself moving toward the presence. You don't feel the presence moving toward you. Instead, something inside adjusts almost on its own, allowing your awareness to meet the presence with a different quality than before. This movement feels as though the mind is rebalancing its own weight, not sinking, not rising, just redistributing its focus in a way that brings the presence into clearer awareness without sharpening it. It doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like alignment, but without directional meaning. The awareness leans slightly, then leans back, then holds as if testing new ways to make contact with the presence. Each variation is small. Each variation is unforced. Each one stays entirely within the quiet you've built. The presence receives these micro motions without reacting. It remains undisturbed, neutral, unchanged. And yet, the awareness that touches it recognizes something different each time, not because the presence shifts, but because you are sensing it through different angles of attention. One moment, it feels muted. The next moment, firmer. The next moment, diffused. None of these sensations form into a pattern. They simply appear as natural effects of the mind's slow internal adjustments. As you stay with this moment, the inner movement becomes smoother. It feels less like a series of changes and more like a quiet tide within your awareness, not a spatial tide, not something rising or falling, just a gentle modulation that changes how you hold the presence. The movement is not something you do. It happens to you, or around you, or within you, but never as a deliberate act. The motion is too soft, too quiet, too lacking in intention to be called an action. This is the first time the presence begins to feel integrated, not because it has changed, but because your awareness has shifted enough times to accommodate it without resistance. The inner motion creates room, not expansion, but room, in the sense that your attention becomes more flexible, more accommodating, more capable of being with the presence without needing to control how it appears. Each internal adjustment feels like a small reorientation. Again, not directional, just a recalibration of how the mind touches the presence. Sometimes the awareness brushes lightly across it. Sometimes it rests with a steadier pressure. Sometimes it circles around it in a way that cannot be described without implying physical movement, even though none is happening. What you feel instead is the mind learning how to hold a faint point without overreaching or withdrawing. The presence, quiet as ever, begins to appear not as something separate, but as something woven into the internal rhythm of the moment. This weaving is not metaphorical. It doesn't imply structure. It describes only the sensation that the presence no longer feels like something you encounter occasionally. It feels like something your awareness now flows around, naturally folding it into the overall experience without needing to call attention to it. As the inner movement continues, small distinctions emerge. The presence sometimes feels more textured, sometimes more silent, sometimes more concentrated, sometimes more faded. These distinctions do not mark progress. They indicate only that the awareness is touching different aspects of the presence as it shifts internally. The variations are small enough that you could miss them entirely if the slowdown hadn't softened the internal noise earlier. The awareness becomes curious, not the active kind, not the reaching kind, but the passive curiosity of sensing subtle differences without trying to interpret them. This curiosity is gentle, almost a background condition. It doesn't direct the moment. It simply follows the internal movement wherever it goes, learning from the way each subtle adjustment reveals another faint aspect of the presence. With each shift, the presence becomes more familiar. It isn't that you know it better, you still cannot define it, but you know how it feels to touch it from different internal positions. That familiarity brings ease. You no longer have to prepare yourself to sense it. You only have to let the inner motion take you to the place where it naturally appears. That place isn't a location. It's a state of attention, one that has become more stable without becoming still. You begin to sense that the presence has always been capable of this subtle interaction, but you were not moving slowly enough before to meet it. Your internal pacing was too quick, your focus too scattered. Now, in this softened rhythm, every tiny internal adjustment becomes noticeable. And because the movement is so soft, the presence becomes part of that softness, responding not by changing, but by revealing the way it sits differently when viewed through different qualities of attention. These micro motions continue not in a cycle, not in a pattern, but in a fluid, quiet unfolding. Sometimes the awareness leans into the presence with greater steadiness, sensing its firmness. Sometimes it wavers slightly, sensing its faintness. Sometimes it meets a sensation you can't name at all, only a muted resonance that seems to belong to neither firmness nor faintness, existing in a space between them. Each encounter happens with ease, without pressure or expectation. In this moment, internal movement feels like the mind's natural language, a soft, continuous modulation that allows the presence to be felt from many angles without turning it into something it isn't. You don't try to interpret any of it. The motion itself is enough. It is the experience, not the path toward an experience. Eventually, the inner movement becomes less distinct. Not because it stops, but because you become accustomed to it. It becomes part of the background rhythm of your awareness, the quiet hum of how your mind navigates this subtle presence. The movement is still there, but it no longer feels like a series of changes. It feels like continuity, soft, slow, and entirely internal. You remain within this continuity, sensing the presence as it shifts gently within your perception. Nothing resolves. Nothing clarifies. Nothing concludes. The inner motion simply continues, guiding your awareness in quiet patterns that reveal only that something inside you is alive in a way too subtle for words, too faint for interpretation, and too quiet for anything other than this slow, dim noticing. There is a moment when the internal movement you've been sensing begins to acquire a new tone, something faintly warm, though not in a comforting or reassuring way. It isn't warmth that spreads, and it isn't warmth that soothes. It feels more like a softening of the internal texture, as though the presence you've been returning to has begun to carry a muted glow that wasn't perceptible until the awareness slowed enough to register it. The presence itself hasn't transformed. What changes is the feeling that the awareness touching it now carries a gentler, almost tender quality. This warmth isn't emotional. It doesn't lift anything or offer relief. It feels more like the sensation of tension, easing, not disappearing, not resolving, just easing enough to open a quieter tone inside the moment. The mind moves across the presence with the same slow rhythm as before, but now each movement holds a softness that wasn't there earlier. The presence feels slightly more welcoming, though not because it wants to welcome anything. It simply matches the lowered internal rhythm more closely, creating the impression of warmth. You begin to notice this warmth in small pulses. It appears when awareness touches the presence lightly, then fades when the attention shifts microscopically away. The pulse is subtle, almost hesitant, as if it only reveals itself when the awareness arrives with the exact softness needed to perceive it. It doesn't linger. It doesn't wrap around anything. It arrives, glows faintly, and then returns to neutrality. The briefness of it makes it feel delicate, almost fragile. This sensation encourages your awareness to settle into an even slower rhythm, not because it is seeking comfort, but because the warmth aligns naturally with the softness of your attention. The moment lengthens. Time feels less segmented, more continuous. And within that continuity, the presence takes on a muted radiance that can only be felt, never interpreted. It isn't light. It isn't brightness. It's closer to the feeling of something internally relaxing, not falling, not yielding, just relaxing its edges enough for a new tone to appear. You sense the warmth again. This time it feels slightly fuller, yet still faint. It doesn't intensify in a way that suggests development. It broadens in sensation only because your awareness has grown more sensitive to it. The warmth is not a signal. It isn't telling you anything. It exists for its own sake, a quiet internal note that hides beneath the presence until the awareness becomes soft enough to hear it. The presence feels different under this warmth. Not transformed, but textured in a new way, like sensing a softness inside something that previously felt more muted. The warmth doesn't alter the presence's neutrality. It adds tone, the way a new color might alter the atmosphere of a scene without changing any of its details. It's a warmth that exists entirely within perception. As you continue to stay with the presence, the warmth begins to appear more regularly. It shows up each time your attention leans gently toward the presence, each time the internal movement settles into a slow, balanced rhythm. These appearances aren't predictable, but they are familiar. They follow no pattern. They emerge when the awareness reaches the precise quietness required to feel them. And with each emergence, the presence becomes easier to inhabit, easier to stay alongside, easier to follow without pressure. There is something intimate about this warmth again, not emotionally intimate, but perceptually intimate. It brings awareness closer to the presence by softening the sensation of distance, even though there is no space involved here. The warmth folds into the moment the way a gentle note folds into silence, neither overtaking it nor disappearing into it. It simply remains where it is soft and persistent without asserting itself. Your awareness adjusts to this new quality. It begins to anticipate the warmth, not by expecting it, but by adopting the internal posture that seems to invite it. The posture is subtle, less tension around attention, less sharpness in perception, less urgency in wanting to know what the presence means. When the awareness becomes this soft, the warmth arrives naturally. It feels like a response, though not from the presence. It feels like a response from your own internal sensitivity. The presence now feels both steady and tender. It hasn't changed, but your perception of it has gained more nuance. The micro movements from earlier haven't disappeared. They simply sit underneath the warmth, now creating a quiet blend of internal sensations that feel unified without being structured. You sense the presence as something soft-edged, something that holds itself without demanding anything from you. The warmth deepens, not in temperature, not in emotion, but in duration. It stays longer before fading. It stabilizes not as an endpoint, but as a tone that can linger without interfering with anything else in the moment. The presence carries this new tone effortlessly, as though it has always been part of it, waiting for the mind to slow enough to reveal it. As you remain in this lowered rhythm, the warmth begins to feel like an anchor, not anchoring you, but anchoring the moment itself. It holds the moment together, giving it cohesion without structure, softness, without sentiment. You don't feel pulled by it. You feel accompanied by it. It moves with you as your attention shifts, fading only when the mind becomes too active, returning when the mind settles back into the quiet cadence. The warmth gives the internal movement a gentler quality. Instead of feeling like a series of adjustments, the internal shifts now feel smoother, like soft transitions that occur without friction. Each movement brings the presence into focus with a slightly different glow, a different hue of softness that changes the feel of the moment without changing its content. You sense the presence more fully now. Not more clearly, clarity would be too strong, but more fully in terms of how much of its tone you can feel. The warmth allows you to hold the presence with less effort, less questioning. It becomes easier to stay with it for extended moments, to let it be part of your awareness without needing to guide or interpret anything. Eventually, the warmth becomes the defining characteristic of this part of the experience. It doesn't dominate, but it shapes the way the presence feels, adding a soft undercurrent to every internal motion. The awareness moves gently across this undercurrent, sensing it as a faint glow that doesn't fade easily. You remain with it, letting the warmth exist without needing to understand it. This warmth isn't an answer. It isn't a lesson. It is simply a new texture, a quiet internal note that appears when the mind is slow enough to feel the subtler qualities of something that has been with you all day, waiting for the rhythm where this kind of noticing becomes possible. There is a subtle change that enters the moment without warning something quieter than the warmth that had begun to shape the previous rhythm. It feels like a lowering of intensity, not emotional intensity, but perceptual intensity, as though the internal light with which you perceive the presence has softened into a dimmer register. This is not darkness and not fading. It is simply the mind choosing a more muted tone, one that allows the presence to sit within a quieter frame. The presence itself hasn't moved or altered. What shifts is the quality of the awareness touching it. The warmth that hovered around it a moment ago now dips into something even softer. The awareness no longer feels like it is approaching the presence. It feels like it is resting in a subdued atmosphere where each sensation becomes rounder, less sharp, less inclined to call attention to itself. The presence stays neutral, but the way you perceive it changes because the internal tone has shifted downward. This dim shift is not a descent. It is not a withdrawal. It is more like a gentle adjustment of the mind's sensitivity, an easing of the edges around perception, leaving everything inside slightly quieter. You sense the presence through this muted register, and it feels more diffuse, more blended into the moment, though not blurred. It remains intact, only less punctuated. The awareness meets it the way a whisper meets a room, gently, lightly, without disturbing anything else. The shift deepens, not by becoming stronger, but by smoothing out the remaining sharpness in your attention. Thoughts that once flickered with mild insistence now move in softer arcs, no longer cutting through the moment, but passing quietly around its edges. This softness acts like a filter, not one that changes what you perceive, but one that changes how loudly it reaches you. The presence benefits from this. It aligns with the dim tone, becoming easier to hold in awareness without strain. As the dim shift settles in, the presence begins to feel more cohesive, not in structure, but in sensation. Its internal variations from earlier, the warmth, the micro pulses, The tonal shifts are still there, but they now sit within a single muted atmosphere. Nothing stands out sharply. Nothing separates itself. Everything feels enclosed in a soft interior quiet where distinction becomes gentle rather than pronounced. You don't lose detail. You perceive detail differently, as though the moment prefers subtlety over clarity. You begin to sense that the dim tone affects not just the presence, but the entire internal field of experience. The mind no longer moves with the tiny impulses that once shaped its pacing. It drifts in a muted sway, not outward or inward, but across its own quiet rhythm. This sway is too soft to be directional, too faint to be called motion. It simply creates the sense that the moment has taken on a new texture, one that holds everything in a quieter frame. Within this dim tone, the presence feels less like an object and more like part of the environment of your awareness. It doesn't stand apart from the experience. It becomes integrated without merging familiar, without becoming identifiable. Its quietness blends with the quietness of the moment until the two are almost indistinguishable, except for the fact that you can still feel it as a distinct internal note. The awareness moves over the presence again, but the touch is gentler, the contact softer. It's not that the presence has changed, your perception has shifted downward into a calmer register where everything is received with less force. You sense the presence as a muted hum within awareness, persistent but not insistent. This hum doesn't vibrate or echo. It simply exists in a tonal range that suits the dim shift perfectly. You notice how your internal surroundings respond to this shift. Thoughts slow, almost to a hush. Internal tensions ease without disappearing, becoming quieter rather than softer. Even the micro movements in awareness take longer to appear, as if the entire internal world has lowered its volume to match the presence. This doesn't feel like stillness. It feels like a gentle reduction in everything that once pulled your awareness outward. The presence grows more familiar within this dim tone. Not clearer, not stronger, just more comfortable to return to. When your attention touches it, the moment seems to settle into a stable rhythm, though not a still one. It is a rhythm without peaks, without accents, without urgency. The presence follows this rhythm naturally, as if it had always belonged to it. You remain with the presence as the dim shift continues to deepen. It feels like the awareness has found a new baseline, a quieter range where the presence can exist without being overshadowed by anything more active. The warmth from earlier hasn't vanished. It's simply been absorbed into the muted tone, leaving behind a softness that feels internally natural. The presence, once faint and scattered, now feels unified, not structurally, but experientially. You sense its quiet constancy, its slight tonal variations, its muted pulse, all wrapped within the dim register that shapes the moment. Nothing sharpens. Nothing becomes clearer. Everything becomes easier to stay with, as though the shift has reduced the friction between awareness and presence. As the shift settles, the awareness begins to explore the presence without moving. It touches different tonal aspects simply by existing in the dim tone. This is exploration without action movement, without direction. You feel the presence from the inside of the moment, not from a place trying to reach it. This interior proximity strengthens the sense that the presence has always been part of your internal environment, only waiting for the quiet that allows it to be seen this way. The dim shift carries a kind of weight, not heavy, but persistent. It gives the moment structure without form, continuity, without clarity. The presence mirrors this quality. It stays low, stays soft, stays muted, offering you an experience that feels whole without needing definition. The awareness rests here easily, not because it's anchored, but because nothing inside pulls it upward anymore. This muted register becomes the natural tone of the moment. You sense everything through it: the presence, the small internal pulses, the faint internal adjustments. They all share the same dim softness, the same gentle texture. You feel as though the mind has entered a quieter phase, one where sharp distinctions no longer matter and subtle sensations are allowed to exist fully. Eventually, you recognize that this dim shift is not a stage, but a state, a condition that shapes how the presence will be felt from here on. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be revealed. The dimness itself is the revelation, the realization that the presence becomes clearest when everything else quiets into the same muted tone. There is a kind of heaviness that enters the moment now, not because anything has grown heavier, but because the awareness itself has shifted into a tone that feels weighted in a quiet, unhurried way. This weight does not press downward. It does not settle over anything. It simply fills the internal space where attention moves, giving each motion a slower contour, a more deliberate feel. The presence you have been returning to sits inside this heaviness without changing. What changes is the way your awareness touches it, as though every point of contact has gained a muted seriousness. Thoughts move differently here. They do not soften or sharpen. They lengthen. Each one arrives with more pause, around it more room to stretch before dissolving. The moment feels thick, not in texture, but in pacing, as if the internal world has agreed to move at a single slow rhythm. The presence fits naturally into this rhythm, becoming easier to stay with, simply because everything else has slowed enough to let it remain in view. You notice how the presence seems to hold its place more firmly, not by anchoring itself, but because the weighted tone of your awareness no longer skips across the surface of the moment. The awareness lingers. It stays. It circles gently, without drifting away. The presence feels fuller, not enlarged, but more complete within this heaviness, as though the slower rhythm allows its quiet qualities to be perceived more continuously. The warmth from earlier is still there, but it feels different inside this weighted tone. It has lost its glow and become something more muted, more internal, like a residue that shapes the moment without calling attention to itself. The presence absorbs this warmth, easily folding it into the low rhythm of the hour. Nothing brightens. Nothing deepens. Everything rests in a single, unhurried pulse. As the weighted rhythm continues, the presence begins to feel more substantial, not because it has changed, but because the awareness touching it has grown denser in its attention. Each internal movement feels slower, heavier, more deliberate. You sense the presence not as a point, but as a tone that persists across time, holding steady, even when your attention shifts briefly away. When you return, it is always there unchanged. There is a seriousness to the moment now. Not emotional seriousness, but the kind that appears when the mind grows too quiet for anything trivial to rise. The presence fits this seriousness without altering itself. It simply becomes the natural thing to notice the object of attention that survives the weight of the hour. The heaviness gives it a kind of muted gravity not pulling you in, but making it easier to remain close. Internal motion becomes slower still. Each shift takes more time to complete, as though thought itself has been dipped in the weighted tone that fills the moment. The presence responds to this by becoming more distinct, not sharper, not clearer, but more resonant. You feel it echo faintly inside the awareness, not as sound, not as meaning, but as a subtle impression that lasts longer than it should. This echo makes the presence feel steadier. It allows you to hold it in perception without needing to grasp. The heaviness supports this, giving your awareness enough weight to remain anchored without effort. Nothing pushes, nothing pulls. The moment exists in a low register where silence becomes the main condition, and everything inside it follows that silence. You notice small tonal variations, again, tiny shifts in how the presence feels when your awareness brushes across different parts of it. These variations are faint, barely perceptible, but the weighted rhythm stretches them long enough for you to sense them clearly. One moment, it feels slightly warmer. Another moment, it feels muted. Another moment, it feels almost absent, only to return with a quiet persistence that reassures you it never left. The heaviness does not remove these variations. It gives them room. The moment holds them, the way late hours often hold the faintest thoughts, gently, without commentary, without urgency. The presence becomes part of this holding an element that survives simply because the slow rhythm allows it to. Your awareness moves differently now. It no longer glides. It presses softly, as though each contact with the presence has gained weight of its own. The pressing is gentle, not forceful, but it gives the moment substance. The presence withstands this without shifting. It remains exactly as it is, quiet, muted, steady. The heaviness does not distort it. It clarifies the tone in which it appears. The longer you remain in this weighted rhythm, the more natural it feels. The awareness stops trying to rise into lighter registers. It stays low, comfortable in a way that has nothing to do with comfort. It is the comfort of inevitability, the sense that this is where the mind naturally goes when all the noise of the day has drained out of it. The presence lives easily inside this inevitability, requiring nothing but the continuation of the heavy quiet. Eventually, you realize that the heaviness itself is the defining feature of the moment. The present simply shapes itself to it existing in a tone where even the faintest shift feels significant. Not meaningful significant in the sense that it becomes part of the internal weight part of the atmosphere that now surrounds everything. Nothing resolves, nothing sharpens, nothing drifts. The presence remains constant in the heavy quiet, and your awareness rests with it in a rhythm that feels neither beginning nor ending, only continuing, pulsing breathing in the low register stillness of the hour. There is a different kind of quiet that enters now, one that feels less like the weighted tone from before, and more like a soft internal thickening of time itself. The moment does not grow darker or deeper. It simply seems to stretch, as if every second lingers a little longer before giving way to the next. Thought does not stop, but each thought arrives wrapped in this extended quiet, slowing the mind into a rhythm that feels suspended rather than heavy. The present sits inside this suspension, effortlessly unchanged, but more noticeable because everything around it has taken on a slower pulse. The awareness you bring to it feels different too. It doesn't feel weighted anymore. It feels diffused across a longer interval, touching the presence with a patience that wasn't there earlier. When your attention approaches now, it arrives without the faint pressure that shaped earlier moments. It arrives gently, loosely, as if the moment itself has softened whatever boundaries once existed between noticing and not noticing. The presence feels the same, yet the way you register it has changed. It seems smoother, quieter, almost rounded, not because its form has shifted, but because your awareness has taken on a texture that blurs sharp distinctions. You don't sense edges. You don't sense divisions. You sense a kind of continuous internal line that stretches through the moment, linking your awareness to the presence without interruption. This continuity feels new. Earlier parts of the night had rhythm waves of noticing moments of micro shifts, pulses of warmth, weighted stillness. But this moment doesn't pulse. It drifts in a single, uninterrupted tone that seems to hold everything in place without holding anything still. The presence appears inside this tone and remains there entirely at ease with a longer, slower flow of time. You sense the presence again, but it feels softer now, not weaker, softer in the way a thought feels when it returns after a long pause, carrying no urgency, no insistence. The presence sits in the quiet, like something that has been acknowledged so often that it no longer needs to press itself forward. Its familiarity does not dull it. It makes it gentler, easier to approach without disrupting the moment. You can feel how the awareness adjusts to this gentleness. It doesn't sharpen. It doesn't focus. It sinks slightly not downward, but inward into the same softness that surrounds the presence. The sinking isn't movement. It's absorption, the awareness easing into a texture that requires no effort to maintain. The moment becomes less about noticing and more about remaining. Remaining in the same suspended quiet, remaining alongside the presence without trying to interpret its tone. There is a fleeting impression that the presence has become more transparent, not invisible, but thin enough that it feels woven into the quiet rather than sitting atop it. When your attention touches it, it feels like touching a smooth ripple inside the silence one that appears and disappears without altering the rest of the moment. Its transparency doesn't make it harder to sense. It makes it easier because there is nothing to push against. You stay with the presence like this, noticing how each contact feels softer than the last. The presence no longer stands out. It floats within the suspended quiet part of it, indistinguishable from it unless you look closely. When you do look closely, you find that the presence has taken on a steady rhythm. Barely a rhythm, really more of a recurring tone that fades and returns without marking any kind of pattern. The suspended quiet amplifies this tone. It allows the presence to feel continuous even when you aren't consciously attending to it. The moment is slow enough that the presence never fully fades, even when your awareness shifts slightly. It remains in the background, not as a shape, not as a signal, but as a stable internal note that resonates through the elongated silence. A sense of ease develops between you and the presence, not comfort ease. The ease of something that no longer needs to be held carefully because it no longer risks slipping away. The moment has softened enough for the presence to remain without effort. It stays, and your awareness stays with it, both held lightly within the extended quiet. You begin to notice that the presence interacts with time differently now. Earlier, It felt like a series of pulses, textures, tones, each one distinct. Now those distinctions blur into a long, slow sweep. The presence feels continuous, the way a quiet hum feels continuous, even when you stop noticing it. There is no beginning to it, no ending. Only a steady sense of here, as if the presence has been part of the moment for longer than you realized. This sense of continuity gives the presence a new dimension, not structure, not shape, but duration. It persists across the slow passage of time, becoming a companion to the quiet rather than a point within it. When you touch it with your awareness, you feel not a singular sensation, but the residue of everything you felt about it earlier in the night. Warmth, weight, neutrality, micro movement, all of it softened into a single tone. You remain with this tone, letting it run alongside your awareness. The suspended quiet shapes everything now. Thought becomes faint, thin, unintrusive. The presence, meanwhile, remains steady. It has no reason to draw attention. The extended quiet already brings you close enough to feel it without needing to reach. You sense it as easily as you sense your own breath when the world is silent, not by focusing, but by not needing to focus. The longer you stay here, the more natural the presence feels. It becomes part of the moment in a way that makes it almost indistinguishable from the quiet itself. The suspended time around you holds it in place, preserving it without effort. Even when your awareness drifts slightly, the presence remains waiting for you to return without changing. Eventually, you realize that the presence is no longer something you are noticing. It has become something you are inside an atmosphere rather than a point, a tone rather than a thing. Nothing has expanded. Nothing has grown. The moment itself has simply stretched long enough for everything inside it to feel unified, soft, and continuous. You stay inside this tone, suspended with it, letting the quiet carry you forward without direction, without purpose, without needing to distinguish between what is you and what is the presence. The two coexist in a single, elongated breath of time, neither leading nor following, both held gently inside the dim continuity of the night. There is a shift that feels less like a change in the presence and more like a soft recalibration in the way you meet it. The suspended quiet from before remains stretching time into long muted strands, but something inside that quiet begins to move differently, not faster, not slower, just with a new kind of subtle emphasis. The presence hasn't grown stronger. It simply begins to register with a faint prominence, as though the moment around it has thinned enough for it to stand out without rising. This prominence is not brightness, not intensity. It's a kind of gentle centrality, the sense that your awareness keeps drifting toward the presence even without intention. You notice this drift not as movement, but as a repeating return, a quiet refusal of the mind to settle anywhere else. Other thoughts form, but they form loosely dissolving before they can interrupt. The presence holds its place in the moment, and your awareness moves around it in a slow arc that feels almost inevitable. The quiet has matured. It is no longer just suspended. It is structured in its slowness, as though it has learned how to hold itself. The presence fits naturally into this matured quiet. It sits with a kind of soft focus, not sharp, not clear, but central. The awareness does not strain to meet it. It simply rests in a position that makes the presence the easiest thing to recognize. You sense the presence again. This time, it feels slightly more pronounced, though nothing has been added to it. The prominence comes from the moment's own reduction, so little remains in the internal space that even the faintest sensation can take on a greater role. The presence becomes the anchor around which the quiet organizes itself, not through force, but because everything else has grown too dim to stand beside it. There is a faint pressure to the presence now. Not weight, not physicality, but pressure in the way a thought can press lightly against the edges of awareness when it wants to be noticed. This pressure is gentle, almost cautious, as if it understands the fragility of the moment and does not want to break it. It remains steady, offering itself without pushing. As you stay with it, the pressure softens into a kind of internal concentration. The presence feels condensed, not dense, not thick, but condensed in the way a single sound feels when the rest of the room goes silent. It gathers your attention without effort, creating a focal point in the quiet that feels natural, even necessary. The mind doesn't fight the focus. It leans into it with a soft, slow acceptance. The moment grows narrower in its attention, though not in its space. It becomes narrower in the sense that fewer things matter within it. The presence becomes the one element that continues to exist with clarity inside the dimness. Other sensations fade, other impressions weaken. But the presence remains sharp enough to feel soft enough to trust quiet enough to stay near without disturbing anything. The quiet deepens further, though it does not darken. It becomes heavier in tone, but lighter in movement, holding the moment together with a stillness that feels crafted around the presence itself. Inside this stillness, the presence feels more complete, not expanded complete, as if it no longer needs to reveal anything else, as if everything it contains is already visible in the muted prominence it carries. You remain with it, sensing how the prominence interacts with the slow rhythm of your awareness. Each time you touch it, the moment recalibrates itself, aligning the quiet around the presence as though it were the center of a low, steady pulse. The pulse isn't literal. It is the rhythm of the moment, the faint cadence of attention returning again and again to the same quiet point without ever questioning why. In this rhythm, the presence begins to feel like a reference point, not a guide, not a meaning, just a point that the awareness trusts. You sense it as something stable, not because it is built to be stable, but because the moment has become soft enough to let it remain undisturbed. The awareness understands this instinctively, settling into a position where the presence can remain within reach without being pursued. Occasionally, a small fluctuation moves through the moment, an internal twitch of thought, a shift in tone, but the presence absorbs these fluctuations easily. It is quiet enough, steady enough, unimposing enough that even small disturbances do not knock it loose. Instead, the moment adjusts, reshaping itself to make room for the presence to remain in view. The awareness begins to sense a new quality in the presence, a faint interior glow, not warm, not bright, but alive. This glow doesn't emanate outward. It stays within the presence, as though the presence has begun to acknowledge its own centrality in the moment. The glow gives it a sense of aliveness that had been muted earlier, a subtle proof that the presence is not static, but continually engaging with the quiet around it. This aliveness does not disturb the quiet. It enhances it. The moment feels more complete, more unified, because the presence has taken on a role that fits perfectly within the dim, slow suspended rhythm. You feel no need to analyze this. The aliveness is simply another tone within the quiet, another subtle quality of something that has been with you all along. You stay beside it. The presence does not rise. It does not transform. It simply continues to sit at the heart of the moment, gaining prominence only because everything else has dimmed enough to allow it. The quiet, the slowness, the extended time, all of these have converged here, creating a setting where the presence feels unmistakably at home. Eventually, you realize that the prominence is not something the presence claimed. It is something the moment granted. The presence has not changed. The quiet has changed around it, shaping itself to reveal the one thing that remained steady throughout the night. And now, with the moment stretched into a long, slow breath, the presence continues to sit exactly where it has always been, central, not because it moved, but because everything else finally stepped aside. There is a moment when the prominence of the presence begins to feel less like an emphasis and more like a quiet inevitability. It no longer stands out because it rises. It stands out because nothing else wants to rise beside it. The internal world has grown so still, so slow, that the presence becomes the only element that retains any kind of steady shape, not a literal shape, but a perceptual firmness that doesn't dissolve under the dimness of the moment. It rests in the quiet with a confidence that asks for nothing, explains nothing, and yet persists as though it belongs exactly where it is. You sense this persistence not through clarity, but through repetition. Each time your awareness shifts, it returns to the presence without effort, without intention, without searching. The presence meets you with the same muted steadiness, the same soft aliveness, the same faint glow that appeared earlier. These qualities do not intensify. They simply reveal themselves in a more consistent rhythm, as if the moment has taught you how to see them without interfering. The quiet has changed again. It is no longer only extended or suspended. It is layered in tone, not layers you can peel or name, but layers of muted consistency that give the moment a kind of quiet richness. Everything inside feels softened, thickened, slowed. The presence fits this richness perfectly. It sits inside it not as something separate, but as something shaped by the same tonal fabric. When you touch it with your awareness, it no longer feels like an object in the moment. It feels like the moment itself, acknowledging its own center. You remain here, noticing how the presence seems more familiar now than it has at any point before. Not because you understand it, not because you followed any arc toward clarity, but because the moment has grown steady enough for the presence to feel natural. Earlier, it was something discovered. Now, it is something assumed, an element that the awareness expects to find whenever it slows down enough to listen. The prominence evolves into something subtler. It no longer announces itself. It simply stays with you in a way that feels quietly inevitable. The internal world seems arranged around it, not in structure, but in tone. The dimness, the slowness, the suspended quality of time, all of it forms a container for the presence, allowing it to exist without resistance. You feel the moment bending gently toward it, not through movement, but through attention. When your awareness meets it now, the contact feels smoother, more continuous. You don't sense a beginning to the noticing. You don't sense an end. It feels as though the presence has been with you the entire time, slipping only behind the noise of the day, never truly disappearing. The quiet confirms this. It makes the presence feel ancient, in a way not old in time, but old in familiarity, as though it preceded every thought that has passed through you. The moment grows even quieter. Thought becomes faint, almost transparent, not gone, only unwilling to push through the thickness of the hour. In this faintness, the present stands out by contrast, not brightly, not sharply, but steadily. It becomes the reference point your awareness uses to navigate the quiet, the one thing that has kept its tone even as everything else shifted around it. You sense a softness inside it, not emotional, not comforting, but soft in the sense that nothing about it resists your attention. It feels porous, as if the awareness can move through it without obstruction. This porosity does not weaken it. It gives it a sense of depth, not spatial depth, but tonal depth, the kind that makes a moment feel layered without needing to define those layers. The present sits in this depth naturally, as though it was designed to be felt this way. As you stay with it, a new quality begins to surface, a faint internal quiet that feels distinct from the external quiet of the room or the hour. This quiet belongs to the presence itself, a stillness that radiates outward without moving. It feels like the presence has become a small reservoir of calm, not calming you, not soothing, not offering peace, simply existing with a steadiness that the mind cannot ignore. This internal quiet creates a sense of unity in the moment. Your awareness seems to merge with the presence not by dissolving, but by aligning with the same dim rhythm. You feel no separation between noticing and being near it. The moment blends them together. What you sense is not the presence from the outside, but the presence as part of the same slow fabric that creates the experience of this hour. Occasionally, a thought tries to rise, but it rises weakly, unable to maintain its shape in the low register the mind has slipped into. These thoughts fade before becoming anything meaningful, leaving behind only the lingering tone of the presence. You realize that even distraction cannot pull you far from it now. The presence has integrated itself into the moment so completely that losing it would require effort, and effort is nowhere to be found in this state. You return again and again, though returning doesn't feel like movement anymore. It feels like remembering something that never left. The present sits quietly inside the dimness, radiating a calm that isn't trying to influence you. It exists, and the awareness simply shares the same small corner of quiet with it. The longer you remain in this corner, the more the presence begins to feel like an internal constant, not insight, not truth constancy, a quality that persists even when everything else shifts. The earlier warmth, the weighted tone, the suspended quiet, all of it seems to have pointed toward this silent constancy, the presence's ability to remain what it is, regardless of how your awareness changes. The moment becomes extraordinarily simple. No analysis, no patterns, no searching. Only you and the presence coexisting inside a quiet that feels effortless, smooth, continuous. The dimness thickens around it, creating an atmosphere where nothing else matters enough to intrude. Even the passing of time feels softened, as though the presence has absorbed some of its sharpness. When you sense the presence again, it feels less like something you observe and more like something that accompanies you. It carries no messages, no demands, no interpretations. It only carries its tone, a tone that has grown steady through the night, shaped by nothing and shaping nothing. And in this calm companionship, you realize that part of the night's quiet now belongs to the presence itself. The two have merged into a single muted continuity, a shared stillness that will carry you deeper into the remaining hours without needing to change, explain, or resolve anything. There is a point in the night when the present stops feeling like something you return to and starts feeling like something that moves with you, even though nothing actually moves. It doesn't follow. It doesn't shift. It doesn't cling. It simply remains close in a way that feels almost natural now, as if the distance between noticing and not noticing has disappeared. The quiet has shaped itself around the presence for so long that your awareness no longer needs to reach for it. It finds it automatically, as though the presence has become the background tone of the moment. This closeness is not intimacy. It is not fusion. It is the quiet recognition that the presence is no longer separate from the rhythm of the night. The awareness, softened by hours of slowing, doesn't approach it with curiosity or hesitation. It meets the presence with a kind of quiet companionship, an unforced alignment that requires no effort. The presence has not changed, but your relationship to it has taken on a steadier, quieter quality. The moment feels different now. Earlier, the presence stood out against the dimness, then against the heaviness, then within the suspended quiet. But now, the moment itself seems built around the presence, as if the night has shaped its entire tone to hold this one internal element in place. Nothing else inside feels as consistent. Thoughts fade quickly. Sensations come and go with little definition. But the presence remains, carrying the same muted tone, the same faint aliveness, the same steady hum that has threaded through every earlier part of the night. You sense it without needing to look for it. It is simply there, like the quiet note in a long piece of music that never disappears even when other notes rise and fall around it. That note becomes the reference point for everything else. And now, the presence feels like that note, the continuous tone holding the moment together. It demands nothing. It offers nothing. It only persists. As you sit with this persistence, the awareness shifts again, not sharply, not noticeably, but enough that the presence feels woven into your perception rather than sitting beside it. You no longer experience it as an object within the moment. You experience it as part of the moment's fabric. The quiet presses gently against it, and the presence responds by becoming more diffuse, more evenly blended into the hour's muted atmosphere. This diffusion doesn't weaken the presence. It strengthens its sense of continuity. You feel it in every part of the moment, now not as a shape or sound, but as a tone that lies beneath the slow, heavy rhythm of thought, a tone that persists even when the awareness drifts briefly towards something else, a tone that returns with the slightest shift of attention as if it had never left. The awareness relaxes around this tone. There is no point in trying to analyze it or define it. Doing so would break the softness with which it exists. Instead, you allow it to be part of the quiet. You allow it to carry you through the moment without needing to understand why it feels so present. The night is too slow for explanation anyway. Only sensing matters now. You notice how the presence reacts to the deeper quiet that has settled over everything. Earlier, it held warmth, then weight, then prominence. Now, It holds none of these. It holds only continuity, a smoothness that has replaced all earlier variations. The presence no longer shifts in tone or texture. It has reached a steady plateau, not because it's stabilized, but because the awareness has softened into a consistency that no longer introduces fluctuations. In this steadiness, the presence feels more complete. Not in meaning, complete in tone. It feels like the natural outcome of the night's progression, as though the entire evening had been gently guiding you toward this quiet companionship. The awareness and the presence share the same rhythm, now slow, low, unbroken. As you stay here, something subtle begins to happen. The present starts to feel less like something you sense and more like something you inhabit. Not physically, not emotionally. Inhabit in the sense that your awareness sits inside the tone of the presence without trying to interpret it. The presence becomes the space in which awareness rests, not a location, not an inner room, but the tonal boundary that defines the moment. This shift is quiet, almost unnoticeable. But once it arrives, the moment feels different. You no longer move toward the presence. You move inside the quality it creates. The presence becomes the condition of the moment rather than the content of it. It becomes the quiet in which you think, the dimness in which you feel, the slowness in which you breathe. Everything inside you begins to take on the same muted quality. You feel a gentle coherence form, not structure, not order, but coherence in the sense that nothing clashes anymore. The presence, the quiet, the slowness, the awareness, they all share. One tone now, one low-frequency hum that shapes the moment more than any individual sensation can. You feel held by it without feeling held to it. Thoughts arise occasionally, but they arise within the tone of the present, shaped by its softness, dimmed by its steadiness. Even the faintest internal movements feel quieted by the companionship you now share with the presence. Nothing interrupts. Nothing disturbs. The presence absorbs everything without reacting. You begin to sense that the presence has stopped being something separate inside you. Its persistence has worn away the distinction between noticing and being near it. You no longer return to it. You are simply with it, in it, around it. The presence has become the lens through which you perceive the rest of the moment, and the rest of the moment has become too quiet to pull you away from it. There is no revelation here, no insight, no new discovery, only the smooth continuity of something that has remained with you long enough that it now feels like the most natural element of the night. The presence exists. You exist beside it. The two of you share a rhythm that needs no interpretation. And in this shared rhythm, the moment becomes easier than thought, easier than awareness, easier than noticing. It becomes something you live inside without effort, carried by the presence that has finally become indistinguishable from the quiet that formed around it. There is a particular quality that appears this late in the night, a quality that feels as though the entire moment has begun to fold into itself, not in shape, not in motion, but in concentration. Everything narrows without tightening, softens without fading, and the presence you have been carrying settles into this narrowing with a quiet confidence. It no longer feels like something you touch. It feels like something that responds to you simply by existing, staying with you, in a tone so even that it becomes difficult to tell where your awareness ends and where the presence begins. The night has taken on a texture that is neither hollow nor full. It is simply consistent, as though time has chosen to move in long, unbroken lines rather than in discrete moments. Inside this consistency, the presence becomes the one thing that does not shift. While thoughts still flutter at the edges, they do so lightly, unable to disturb the equilibrium that is formed. The presence rests within that equilibrium, matching it, shaping itself to it, without changing any of its own qualities. You sense it now as something close, not by distance, but by familiarity. The presence has shared enough quiet with you that your awareness can find it effortlessly, even without intention. It hovers in the moment, like a faint note held beneath a piece of music, the one tone that gives the entire composition its grounding. Nothing draws attention to it, yet everything seems to take its cue from it. As you remain with it, a kind of internal blending begins. Not merging, not dissolving blending, in the sense that the awareness stops feeling like a separate entity navigating the quiet. The quiet and the awareness share the same texture. The presence rests inside that texture as if it were designed for it. You no longer observe the presence from afar. You register it from within as though your mind has taken on its exact tone. This blending gives the moment a sense of continuity so smooth it almost feels unreal. There are no breaks in perception, no moments of reorientation. Everything flows in a single directionless motion, and the presence seems to hover at the very center of this flow, not leading it, not following it, simply existing as part of it. The awareness does not sink or rise. It drifts at the same level of softness, allowing the presence to remain within reach without being held. There is a quiet certainty to the presence now, an assurance that does not come from change, but from repetition. It has remained through every shift in the night, the warmth, the heaviness, the dimness, the slowness. It has survived the narrowing of thought, the lengthening of time, the smoothing of awareness. By the time you reach this moment, the presence feels inevitable, as though it has always existed beneath your daily noise and only needed the long quiet of the night to reveal itself fully. Your awareness rests more deeply into it. Rest here does not mean relaxation. It means the awareness stops seeking alternative anchors. It no longer needs to wander, or test, or adjust. Everything else inside you has become so muted that the presence feels like the only element with enough stability to track. Even this tracking feels effortless, the awareness simply leaning in the direction where the presence already is. Occasionally, a small shift moves through your perception, a thought, a reminder, a flicker of emotion, but each shift fades more easily than before, absorbed into the same muted rhythm. The presence remains untouched by these interruptions. It sits at the core of the moment, resilient in its quietness, unbothered by any disturbance. This resilience is not strength, it is neutrality. A neutrality so steady that disturbances lose the ability to pull you away. The moment continues to stretch. The quiet deepens. The presence remains. At this point, the presence feels less like something you return to and more like something you orbit. But even orbit is the wrong word. It suggests movement, and movement has long since softened into something indistinct. Instead, you exist within a shared tone, a mutual quiet that feels complete despite offering no conclusion. You begin to notice a faint internal glow again. Not light, not warmth, Glow in the sense of a perceptual brightness that arises when the mind becomes highly attuned to a single internal point. This glow doesn't spread. It doesn't illuminate anything. It simply rests inside the presence, pulsing so softly that you could miss it if you focused on it directly. The glow is not new. It is merely more noticeable now that the rest of the moment has become so stripped of noise. The presence takes on a slight fullness within this glow, a gentle completeness that doesn't alter its tone. It remains quiet, but the quiet feels thicker around it, more substantial, not dense substantial, as though the presence now contains everything it needs to exist, exactly as it is without needing context or contrast. It stands alone in the night's interior soundscape, not loudly, but undeniably. Your awareness settles further. It no longer analyzes. It no longer questions. It no longer wonders what the presence is or why it has stayed. This late in the night, the mind loses interest in meaning. It prefers sensation tone rhythm. And the presence offers all three in the faintest and most consistent form. You take it in the way you take in the sound of breathing when the world is silent, not consciously, not deliberately, but because nothing else exists with enough continuity to register. The moment becomes almost circular, though not in a literal sense. It loops gently, each loop, bringing you back to the same quiet, the same tone, the same presence. The awareness follows this loop, easily, never encountering an edge, never reaching a boundary. Everything falls into place, not through order, but through mutual softness. Eventually, the presence begins to feel like the only real thing left in the moment. Thought has thinned too much to compete. Emotion has gone quiet. Sensation has narrowed into small, unremarkable pulses. What remains is the present, steady and unchanging, carrying the same tone it carried when you first noticed it, but felt now with far more depth, simply because the night has stripped away everything else. You stay with it. There's nowhere else for the awareness to go. Nothing calls it away. Nothing interrupts. The presence has become the constant in a moment where everything else has become faint. And this constancy feels like the natural progression of the night, the quiet culmination of hours spent noticing, slowing, narrowing, dimming. You remain here near it, inside it, alongside it, whatever word fits the sensation of sharing a rhythm with something that has no shape, no voice, no identity. The presence is simply there, and you are simply with it, held in the same muted current of the night. There comes a final quiet in the night that doesn't feel like an ending, yet everything inside it behaves as though an arc has come to rest. The presence you have been moving with no longer feels like something you reach, sense, or inhabit. It feels more like a tone that is fully merged with the background of your awareness, a steady undercurrent that neither rises nor fades. It exists without effort now, not because it has become stronger, but because the mind has grown quiet enough for its consistency to feel natural. The moment has lost all sharpness, not blurred, not softened, simply stripped of anything that does not belong to this low, muted rhythm. Thoughts move slowly, more like impressions than ideas. Sensations appear only at the edges, faint and temporary. The presence, however, remains with a calm continuity that feels less like persistence and more like acceptance. Acceptance of the hour of the quiet of the state your awareness has settled into. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't glow. It simply exists at the core of the moment without needing attention to remain. As you sit in this quiet, you notice that the presence no longer shifts. Earlier in the night, it offered warmth, weight, tone, prominence, a sense of companionship. Now it offers nothing, and that nothingness feels complete. The presence has reached a state where it does not need to change in order to remain felt. It has become a constant, a quiet fact of the moment, as fundamental as breath or silence. The awareness meets it without effort, without hesitation, and without the sense of returning to anything. You are already where it is. The night feels full in a way that has nothing to do with content. It is full because nothing more can be added. Every movement, every shift, every variation that could have appeared has already passed through. What remains is the distilled essence of the presence, a steady, unbroken note within the quiet. It is not bright. It is not dark. It is simply there, carrying the exact tone that has followed you through every part of this long, unfolding interior journey. Your awareness begins to settle into a state that feels almost motionless, not stiff, not frozen motionless, in the sense that nothing inside you wants to move. Every impulse to examine, interpret, or track the presence has faded. The mind is too quiet for analysis now, too slow for curiosity. What remains is a soft, unthinking connection to the presence, a connection sustained by the rhythm of the moment rather than by effort. The presence feels familiar in a way that transcends recognition. It feels familiar, the way silence feels familiar. After a long day, the sense that it was always available, but only revealed itself when everything else became quiet enough. You realize now that the presence had never disappeared during the day. It had simply been drowned out by noise. The night hasn't created it. The night has only uncovered the conditions under which it can be known. The quiet grows deeper, though it doesn't become heavier. It grows deeper in the sense that your awareness has fewer distractions to cling to. It has shed the last remnants of urgency, the slightest tendencies to rise or drift. What remains is the ability to sit with the presence without needing anything from it, not understanding, not meaning, not comfort. The presence offers none of these. It offers only itself. This offering feels strangely complete. Earlier, you may have expected the presence to reveal something, to lead somewhere, to culminate in some hidden understanding. But now, in this last stretch of the night, you see that the presence was never a puzzle. It was never a message. It was simply a part of you that the noise had obscured, quiet, steady, and honest in its refusal to become anything except what it already is. You notice that when your awareness touches it now, the touch doesn't create a reaction. The presence does not pulse or brighten. The moment does not shift. Everything feels as still as it can be without becoming static. The presence has settled into a tone that feels final, not because it ends something, but because nothing more needs to arise. The awareness stays with it easily. Even the idea of staying feels unnecessary. The presence and the awareness share the same interior space so completely that separation no longer feels meaningful. You aren't observing it anymore. You're sharing the same quiet. A softness spreads through the moment, not soothing softness, not emotional softness. This is the softness of nothing left to do. The mind has reached the end of its movement. The night has reached the end of its arc. The presence has reached the end of its unfolding. Everything simply is. The presence holds its tone. The quiet holds its shape. Your awareness holds nothing. There's a faint beauty in this, not the kind that lifts or comforts the beauty of something unchanging, something that needs no explanation, a beauty that doesn't move, a beauty that doesn't try. You notice the presence once more, and for the first time, it doesn't feel like an object. It feels like an environment. It feels like the quality of the moment. You aren't sensing it. You are inside it. And the night, in turn, feels like it has wrapped itself around this shared stillness, as if everything has condensed into the smallest possible point of awareness. Inside this point, nothing rises, nothing resolves, nothing concludes. The presence does not fade when you stop focusing on it, nor does it sharpen when you bring your awareness closer. It remains exactly as it has been, quiet, steady, unintrusive, complete. You sit with it, and the moment stretches around you. There is no desire to move forward, no desire to hold on to anything. The presence has become part of the simple truth of being here quietly in this dim interior hour. And as the night rests, the presence rests with it, not as a destination reached, but as the quiet that was waiting underneath everything from the beginning.